I'm trying to think. It's about 5 Potawatomi fluent speakers, native speakers, and that was their language. So we're trying to bring that back. And we have some episodes about that. A couple of apprentices, citizens who went to Wisconsin, and they spent 3 years there learning the language.
Podcast Junkies, episode 194. Welcome back. I'm your host, Harry Duran. Hope everyone's doing well today as we head into, at the time of this recording, spring, Mayflowers, April showers, etc., all that sort of stuff. If this is the first time you're hearing my voice, thank you so much for checking out this show. This is a passion project that's been going 5 years strong now, since 2014. And closing in on episode 200, we're going to have a very special guest for you. Regular listeners of the show will probably know who that's going to be. In case you missed last week's episode, we had a nice conversation with John M. of Sober Speak. He is the host of Sober Speak and has been in the Alcoholics Anonymous program for over 30 years. And the podcast covers stories from folks that have been not only in that program, but any of the other 12-step recovery programs. And it was just a nice conversation with someone who is really passionate about his guests. And I learned a lot about the organization. And I think if you haven't listened to it, you will as well. So I appreciate John for taking the time to come on. As I appreciate Kyla Carneiro, who is this week's episode. She's the host of 2 podcasts. One is Yajmownen. I knew I was going to mess that one up. And So It's a Show. The former is a podcast that she created by working with the Potawatomi tribe. So this episode is full of tongue twisters. And we hear the story of how she connected with them and helped them start a podcast. We talk about how we initially met at Podcast Movement, now going back over 2 years ago. She covers the interesting power of passing history down from generation to generation through storytelling, and the potential for Native Americans to use podcasting to share their stories is something we talked about as well. She talks about some of the reactions she had from her podcast and what she's learned from not only doing the podcast, both of the podcasts herself, but also the opportunity that she had to appear at Podcast Movement on stage at a podcasting panel. And she received a lot of valuable feedback on the format of her shows, which we share as well. We talk about the format of both of the shows and dive in a little bit deeper on So It's a Show and why she actually took the opportunity to create a new podcast that was very different than what she had done with her first. We have a lot of fun on the show because it's a chance for me to reunite with old friends, and I'm sure that comes through in our conversation. This episode is brought to you by the one and only Scarlett 2i2 from Focusrite. It is my go-to sound card of choice. I've been using them for years now. I'm trying to remember back when I first gave it a shot, and I was so impressed with the sound quality and the portability of it that it just became my go-to recommendation, and it's what I tell clients to use every time we do a new show and a new setup for them. I always have my Samson Q2U as the go-to microphone and the Focusrite Scarlett 2i2 as my go-to sound card. The beauty of it is that it makes everything easy, and it gives you a panel at the front of the sound card for you to easily control the levels of not only your microphone, which is extremely important, but also your headset, your headphones, so you can continue to monitor your sound, which I think is really important for you as a podcaster to be considerate of when you're recording with a guest, to make sure you always know what it is that your mic sounds like, and also helps to pick up ambient noise in the room that you might not be aware of. So the Focusrite Scarlett 2i2 makes that extremely easy to do, and I'm happy to have built a relationship with Dan and the folks at Focusrite, and it was great to always meet them at these podcasting conferences. So my go-to recommendation for when you're ready to step up your audio sound to the next level. Don't forget to listen to the end of the episode for the retention hashtag. And if you're new to the show, it's a little Easter egg at the end, and you'll have to listen to the end to get to it. But for now, let's jump into this conversation with Kyla. So Kyla Carneiro, host of Yajmownen, and So It's a Show. Welcome to Podcast Junkies.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So this took us a couple of times to reschedule.
But we made it.
Yes, but we made it. I always like to start off the show with the story of how we connected. It goes back to Podcast Movement 2016.
Yeah, Chicago.
What were you doing at Podcast Movement, and what were you attending?
Just, hanging out. No, I was just about to start a podcast, Yajmownen, at my work, and I was looking for some training, some sort of conference, and found Podcast Movement. And I'm in Southwest Michigan, so Chicago is just a little bus ride.
Yeah.
So no big deal there. So went over, and now I've been to 3. So, and I've seen you at all of them now.
Did you actually take a bus there?
I did. I don't mind taking buses. Other people hate it, but I like it. I just hop on and don't have to think.
Had you ever been to a conference of that type or that size?
I have been to a couple social media conferences because that's really what my job started as, writing and social media. And then we wanted to get into more storytelling and audio storytelling. So I was like, I'm kind of done with the social media conferences. I get the basics. Look at your analytics. So I needed something about podcasting and storytelling. And so Podcast Movement was great.
Which social media ones have you been to?
Let's see. I still get emails from them. So Social Media Summit.
Okay.
And I don't remember.
Social Media Marketing World is the big one.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
That's the one in San Diego.
Okay. Oh, nope, San Francisco. Yeah, I don't know.
You would remember that one because A, it's pretty pricey, and B, they do this pretty cool thing on a battleship for the opening night. It's like a meet and greet, and they give you this puzzle or this game where you basically have to find, there's like fun facts about people in the room, and you just have to figure out who it's about. So you have to go and talk to like almost everyone in the room because you're like, is this you? Or find someone who does this, or find someone who has a dog or something like that. So it's pretty cool because it forces interaction with people. So
that's a really good idea for a conference.
Yeah, people who've been there talk about that a lot, so they like that.
Yeah, no, I didn't go to that.
So what was your impression? Because I've been to Podcast Movement from the beginning when it was a Kickstarter and it was in Dallas and it was really small, and I remember it was like a lot of people talking about like entrepreneur stuff, and to see what it's become now is so bananas. I think I saw Jared in Las Vegas at NAB a couple of weeks ago, and I heard that they might get like 3,000 people there, and I know
is there room for it that year? Where we are going to be? It's
going to be it's in Orlando. So yeah, that's the land of conferences. So I think they'll. But what was your impression when you first got there? Like in terms of like, I've heard interesting things from people about the community. So I'm wondering what your experience was like as a first timer.
It was overwhelming. I was super intimidated talking about different shows with people. And I was like, man, I don't know about any of these. Who is that podcaster? How do they know them? But then I quickly realized, well, there are thousands of shows. Of course, I'm not going to know all of them.
Yeah.
But it wasn't intimidating because it seemed like other people had a lot more knowledge, which they did. That was fair. They've been doing it longer than I had. But I just felt like I had met my people, like, and now it kind of feels like summer camp, honestly, like, oh, hey, everybody, still talk to you and people I met the first year and the second year and third year. So yeah, it was intimidating, but I learned a lot.
So I imagine you were focused more on the beginner tracks and like literally like what to do, how to get started. Did you know anything about podcasting when you showed up?
I have background in video.
Okay.
So as far as editing, like the technical side, that came easily because if I can edit video, I can edit the audio essentially. What did I focus on that first year? It's hard to remember. I think I listened a lot. I went to a lot of sessions about interviewing techniques, and I was just kind of soaking it all in.
Yeah, it is a lot. And sometimes I take it for granted because when I go, you mentioned summer camp, and that's what it's like for me. It's like I call it a high school reunion because the more you go, the more friends you have to add to the list. And every time you go back, now you keep seeing more. And sometimes you only see them then. Like, thankfully, I go to other podcasting conferences, so I catch up on all my podcasting peeps. But when you have a podcast that talks about podcasters or interviews podcasters, you tend to make a lot of new friends from the show that you want to catch up with, and so it gets kind of crazy. And sometimes I don't get to go to the sessions because I get stuck in the hallways having all these conversations with all my friends.
I remember you saying that, and I'm not sure if I'm going back this year, unfortunately. But just being farther away and everything. But I feel like that would happen to me this year if I went like, I'm just going to talk to people. But that's super valuable too.
Yeah. So what are you currently editing in?
Adobe Audition.
Okay. It's funny because you gravitate towards the tools you already know. And I had done some electronic music production when I got first started. So I was using Ableton Live, which is like a full-blown tool for music producers, and it's like meant to produce like actual music. But that's what I knew, and it's obviously overkill. But I use Hindenburg now, which is a lot simpler because it just focuses on like editing voice, and you don't need all the other bells and whistles. But and you're liking it?
Yeah, I love Adobe Audition because I can edit right on the audio piece. You know, I don't have to click a bunch of buttons. It just felt really natural to me. I don't know. Final Cut is what I've always used to edit video. Yeah. It felt really similar.
Can you recognize like ums and lip smacks now on the WAV file?
Yes. Yes, I know what my ums look like, which you'll get to know a little bit if you go through this. But yeah, those little pieces. I love both sides. Like I love getting into the technical side of it, even though the creative and the interviewing and the storytelling is what drew me to it. But I love the technical. I love that I can recognize the ums.
And did you have an idea for what the show would be before you went? And did that change at all after you left Podcast Movement?
I started with wanting to share stories of our citizens, because I guess I should say I work for the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians, which is a tribal government in Michigan, Southwest Michigan, and we have land in northern Indiana. So I'm not a tribal citizen myself, but I was hired for their website and social media, and this was something that our chairman wanted to try, and storytelling is a big part of the tribe's culture, especially audio storytelling and speaking it verbally as opposed to writing it down. So it was kind of a perfect fit, podcasting was. So I was really inspired by Death, Sex, and Money and their format with Anna Sale. So that is a little bit how I based it off of to begin with, as far as cold open and then the real opening and then getting into the story with some narration. And I've stuck with that for the most part, but I'm working on one right now. Just had an elder come in and share a few stories that are not true, but they share, lessons. So I'm putting in some sound effects and things. So that's kind of fun and different. Yeah, so I released the first episode the day that Podcast Movement started, 2016. And so I did have an episode that I could share with people and ask for feedback on. But after Podcast Movement, I think it just gave me more. The first episode was rough. It was short. I didn't know how long of an interview I needed to get for a 20-minute episode. So I definitely learned from releasing the first episode, getting that over with, and then going to Podcast Movement.
So can you talk a little bit more about how you ended up working with that tribe and a little bit of their background?
Yeah, so I lived nearby where the tribe is before. So I was looking at jobs, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I have a journalism degree, did not want to be a reporter, not interested in news journalism, more feature and storytelling. And so there was a job for our local paper. And I looked at that and I was like, oh man, I do not want to do that. But right next to it was a job for the Pokagon Band. And I didn't even know they existed, which many people did not know they existed, even though they've been there, of course, since before we were. And interviewed and was hired. So it's not a magical story, even though it seems like it should be, because it's a world that I was never a part of and that most people aren't a part of, But in Michigan, where we are, the tribe, it's not set up on reservation land like you think in the West. So it's parcels of land. Some of it's connected, some of it is disconnected. And so we have sovereignty on those portions of land. So we have our own police force and our own laws and things, pretty similar to American laws. You're not going to walk onto the land and then suddenly be arrested for, chewing gum. But started there, and then my position just really grew with what I was interested in and what we had need for. So yeah, now podcast is now my favorite part of my job.
So what I thought it's interesting, you said it's the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi. So Potawatomi is the tribe?
Potawatomi.
Potawatomi is the actual tribe then?
So there are several tribes of Potawatomi Indians. So there's some in Oklahoma, and the Pokagon Band is unique because they weren't forced from their land. So we're on the original land that they lived on, and the parcels of land that we've purchased and that we've gotten sovereignty over is where those original communities lived before English settlement. So we were able to stay on our land, whereas other Potawatomi tribes, a lot are in Oklahoma and some others in the surrounding area. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it's fascinating because I think, when people think of tribes, they're familiar with like the ones that are in popular culture. They've heard a lot of Apache, Sioux, and Cherokee, but I don't think people realize like actually how many different tribes were in this land before everyone else arrived. Do you know what that count is?
There's more than 562 federally recognized tribes.
Wow.
And federal recognition is essentially the federal government saying, okay, we recognize you as a tribe because you've met these qualifications, and now you can get certain benefits as far as funding from government organizations, and you can get sovereign land. But that's a whole nother process. You're not just given a piece. You have to go through a very long, thorough process with the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Okay. Interesting distinction there is that you said federally recognized. There's probably a list of tribes that were never recognized, but they self-declared or something like that, right?
Yeah, because if there aren't enough people to make up accounts, or if not enough people are practicing, there might be a whole community, but they aren't aware of it, or those traditions weren't passed down. And so, yeah, it's a whole process. And we were federally recognized in 1994. So we have some awesome photos of a lot of the community members in the Oval Office with President Clinton as he's signing the recognition.
That's cool. I think what's fascinating is this idea of normally in the Native American tradition, stories are a huge component of how history is passed down from generation to generation. I mean, natives across the world, not just obviously here, but I think that's how tradition is handed over from and it's how they keep and honor the traditions of the past, because obviously there's nothing, to document, and you would just have to rely on the elders to tell you the stories, and it's probably something that's built into the culture, like don't forget to pass on the stories, and don't forget to pass on the stories. And is that something you were already familiar with? Or is that something you just became more aware of as you started working with them?
Yeah, I didn't know much about Native American tribes. I could not have told you anything that I just told you before I started working. So I felt honored, like it felt special that they would welcome in other people and share all this with. And now I don't take part in ceremonies and things. It's not like I'm a member of the tribe by any means, but working for the government has been really eye-opening. When would I have ever learned all of this without working there and being there daily? But as far as the storytelling, I even just learned it further along as I worked there. So I started the podcast in 2016, but I started working there in 2014. So I didn't learn the importance until, even in 2016. And then we have other storytelling programs as far as just recording people. Because, yeah, you're right. Audio, sharing it verbally is how they've shared their culture and their language. And with all that has happened from the time that English settlers came here until now, there was a big breakdown in culture and passing that down. And we have some episodes about that on Yajmownen, someone talking about their mother who was in a boarding school. So in the 40s or 50s, in the 1900s, a whole generation of Native American kids were taken from their families, put in boarding schools. Their hair was cut. They weren't allowed to speak their language. So like this whole generation just not ended the culture, but it just took away. It didn't allow this whole generation to pass that down to their kids. So there are only, I'm trying to think, it's about 5 Potawatomi fluent speakers, native speakers, and that was their language. So we're trying to bring that back, and we have some episodes about that. A couple of apprentices, citizens who went to Wisconsin, and they spent 3 years there learning the language.
Wow.
From fluent speakers, and now they've brought it back and are teaching, and they have their own apprentices. So rebuilding is huge.
It's so important because of the archival nature, and I'm assuming they'll keep updating the technology so we can listen to the audio forever. But now, since for those tribes that are actually smaller and didn't have the ability to keep continuing the tradition for whatever reason, because of our the settlers' influence or just the dwindling numbers, it seems like I think that every tribe should have a podcast to tell their story, to tell their stories. And have you, because of the work you're doing here, has anyone approached you, or have you familiarized yourself with like what's happening, or is anyone doing something similar with other tribes?
There is a Native American radio network, and they have some different shows, but not really interviewing and storytelling. And ours, they're present day stories. So they're citizens living their lives right now. And we talk about the past a little, but I think a big misconception I know is that Native American culture and life is in the past, and we're remembering the past, but it's really, it's the present. Those traditions and practices still live on. So I don't know of another tribe doing this exactly as far as having a podcast, and I haven't looked for a few months, I think, but like I'll go and I'll try to see if there's somebody else so we can collaborate. But no, I'm sure that there are other tribes who are archiving these stories though, and recording them, just not sharing them in a podcast. But yes, really everyone needs a podcast, but yeah, I think every tribe does.
So maybe your next project is going to be starting the Native American Podcast Network.
Well, I think I'd feel more comfortable with that if I was Native American myself, but I could help.
What's been the reaction to the people that have either heard the show or the people that you've had on the show?
I have been really encouraged by it. I love seeing the interaction online with other citizens. So I had someone on recently, Lindsay Williams, and called the episode Shining Thunderbird, a woman, because she just got her given name, her native name, from a healer. And so she just had been through a lot, and she wasn't always, she said so herself, was not always on her best behavior, but then just turned her life around, got out of a bad abusive situation, came into the community, and they really just lifted her up, and she just got an eagle feather, which is the highest honor you can get. So just to see that transformation, and then everyone's reaction on Facebook, where we have a lot of citizens, which is like, wow, great job, Lindsay. That's amazing. And so proud of you. And so I really love seeing that. That's really the whole point. It's for our citizens. It's for our community. And people from the outside are welcome to listen and learn, but it's really for our citizens. So the reaction has been a lot of community building, which was what we wanted to see. And another citizen who just passed the bar, and that again was just like, hey, good job. Like, look at where you came from and where you are now. So a lot of those kinds of stories, and try to get a diverse, as far as age and gender, and to not just be, sharing from one part of the community, but everybody. And
what have you learned, or what have you changed since you started? Because you probably had a format and an idea in mind for what the show would be, but now that you've got all these episodes under your belt, like, how's that changed?
I think when I first started, I was looking for, like, what are those amazing, life-changing, like, what stories that just shock you? And I realized that's not what people care about most in the community. So first I was so focused on getting those stories that, big national podcasts can find because they have a lot of people, research time, and a very large people who they can interview. And we have 6,000 citizens, and most of them are, a large percentage are kids. So, less than that, and then less than that who live nearby. So I was looking for those. And then I started realizing I interviewed a citizen who was going to scuba school. Pretty basic. I mean, but still interesting. Like, who goes to scuba school? And posted that, and people had the same reaction of, wow, that's so cool. That's so interesting. Great job, Skylar. And so through that, I think people just want to hear from each other, and they just want to connect. And, plenty of citizens, just because of how the larger society is structured, don't live in the community. They live elsewhere because of family or job. And so being able to connect with people intimately, audio is so intimate, and being able to hear from other citizens, I think means a lot, whether or not they just saved 20 people's lives or went to scuba school.
Well, it's fascinating because I think every podcaster thinks about that. And, you hear some of these, you mentioned Death, Sex, and Money. So people, podcasters who are familiar with like how the reach of those shows, they're like, well, why is my show not getting like 1 million downloads? And then, but something you alluded to is really interesting, because I thought about that. Like, I was going after like big podcasters when I started, and I was like, I want to have all the big names, and I'm only going to talk to people who've had like 50 episodes. And then over the years, I've realized like it's so much more interesting if I scratch my own itch in terms of curiosity and conversations that I want to have. And I've had just a random number of folks, and a lot of the conversations that I have are with people that I've connected with previously, because I feel that's a more intimate conversation. And you can sort of tell when two people are talking that I've never met before, because it's really like, it takes a while to sort of like break the ice with them. And I've had occasionally some folks like, that I've had the opportunity to talk to where I wanted to talk to them. So that's why I hadn't met them previously. But for the most part, I think it's just really interesting, because I'm fascinated by how people, like, podcasting is like the starting point, but then we just dive deep, and I think that's something like I think what you just referenced is the idea of just telling the stories of those people, and that's much more engaging, especially for the people that listen. Are you introducing people to the world of podcasting who have never even heard podcasts as well?
Yeah. Oh, lots of that. Whenever someone comes in my office, someone new, I'm like, hey, have you listened to our podcast? And they're like, we have a podcast, or what's a podcast? Yeah. And I say, here's my card. Show me your phone. Do you have, Apple or Android? I can show you how to find it. So I do a lot of that. And hopefully we have subscribers. Yeah. So like definitely people have gotten it. And we have, some direct communication with citizens that I'm able to use to share those out. And I ask people all the time when I see them, just for feedback, like, hey, what do you want to see more of from us? And they're just like, more episodes, more podcast episodes.
That's good.
I'm like, okay, good. You like them.
What's the current frequency?
Oh, I would love to be able to say that's super consistent, but with finding those people and scheduling, it's supposed to be once a month. Okay. And oftentimes it is, but sometimes I skip a month. So about once a month.
Well, you do have another podcast you got to attend to as well, right?
Yeah, but that no one's paying me or asking me to do.
So talk a little about So It's a Show.
Yeah, and I thought of that when you said, you can tell when two people are having a conversation and they've never met, because my co-host and I actually were not friends before we started hosting together. But people tell us we sound like we're friends. We're best friends from a long time. So I'm like, okay, I guess we're doing something right. But that is So It's a Show, and it's totally different from Yajmownen. And it's about the pop culture references in Gilmore Girls, the TV show. So that started out of me loving the show, but also recognizing that I did not know what in the world so many of those characters were talking about when they would reference different movies and characters and people. And I was like, what are they saying? And so it just came out of my own curiosity and my own need to understand what they're talking about, because I love the show so much, but I wasn't understanding I don't know, 25% of the dialogue because they spout off these references all the time. And so I was looking for a co-host, though, because I didn't feel that was one I could host on my own. It just didn't seem as interesting if it was just me talking, whereas I could have someone to bounce off of. So I was kind of thinking among my friends, who loves Gilmore Girls? Who would be into this? And I was social media friends with Taylor because we went to school together, went to college together. And she had posted online about Gilmore Girls, and I was like, oh, she likes Gilmore Girls. That's cool. And then a while later, she was like, oh, here's a couple movie reviews. And I was like, oh, okay. She reviews movies. She knows about pop culture. Maybe I'll ask her. And then she posted a photo that she went to a live taping of a podcast. Like, okay, she's got all the criteria.
All the boxes checked.
Yep. So I just reached out to her. It's like, hey, I know this is really random and we don't talk, but what do you think? And I actually posted it. I actually reached out to her. It was November 6th of 2016. So if that date rings a bell, I just felt like I should just do this. Who knows what's going to happen in the world? And she was kind of feeling the same way. So we talked for an hour and she was like, all right, let's do this. And then we recorded our first episode, which is so rough. And I need to put a little recording at the beginning that says, this episode was our first one. And it does not closely reflect how the rest of our episodes are. Please skip ahead.
Every podcaster in the world would have to create that because, like, if you literally, I just hit the 5-year anniversary on April 9th, and it's the 18th when we're recording this, so a couple of weeks ago. So I just released the trailer that I put out on that day, and everyone, I think every single podcaster cringes, like when they hear their voice, when they hear like how nervous they sound in the beginning. So all that stuff is true for everyone that's podcasting.
Yeah, I mean, our first episode was, I think it was like 20 minutes. The rest of ours are usually an hour now, so very different as far as timing. And we were so structured and we had our sections, and instead of what it is now, which is, it's a free-flowing conversation, but we've done our homework, we've done our research, and we're sharing. We know who's going to talk next, but we are able to feed off of each other too. So it's casual in the way we talk, but it's a lot of research goes into it.
There's so many podcasts that, I mean, there's a whole genre of podcasts that are based on TV shows, which is its own thing. So do you use the episodes as like the basis for the episodes of the show as the basis for an episode of the podcast?
Yeah, sort of. So we started in season 1, the pilot episode, and we choose one pop culture reference to focus on from every episode of Gilmore Girls. We've skipped a couple when none of the references warranted an entire episode to talk about, but for the most part, we've stuck to that. And we summarize the Gilmore Girls episode, but it's really about the pop culture. So it's really niche because if you gotta like Gilmore Girls, you gotta like pop culture, which if you like Gilmore Girls, you probably like other pop culture.
So what have you learned? Because if you're digging deep on pop culture references that you knew nothing about, and it looks like you're up at about 47 episodes now, that's a lot that you're actually learning in the process.
Yeah, I'm editing our episode 54 right now, and we release every other week. And we've taken a couple holiday breaks, but besides that, we've been going for 2.5 years, and I have learned so much. I mean, let's see, I watch Misery, which that one's a little newer.
I love that. Mary
Tyler Moore Show, That Girl. Oh no, is this going to separate us as far as generations? No. Be like, I know all of these guys.
Well, it's funny because if you think about when Gilmore Girls came out, which is like 90s, right? So they're probably referencing obviously they're referencing shows and things that are before them. So they're talking about stuff from the 80s and the 70s, and Mary Tyler Moore, that's the 60s. Yeah. It's a fascinating way to sort of get yourself up to speed with, just references to things that people would basically just ignore and be like, I don't know what you're talking about. But it's fascinating that you actually use that as the basis to start the show. So you were curious when you were watching enough to say, what are they talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to start my own podcast on the side when I started after Yajmownen. I was like, okay, I'm ready. I
Yeah.
need another one. And I had this idea just completely out of necessity. I was like, I need to know. And one of the most timely references that we covered was gaslighting.
Oh, wow.
And that's a term that we've been hearing all about. And that was a
Yeah.
movie from, was it the 40s? And so you really have to watch it to the whole movie to fully understand that concept. And
The movie's called Gaslighting?
the movie's called Gaslight.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I mean, I know the term, obviously, and it's a reference to our current political climate. We'll just leave it at that. But
yeah, and it fits so perfectly. And so watching several episodes of a TV show or watching a whole movie to understand these, like, you really get it. So I've been enjoying it thoroughly because now I can reference things
yeah.
that I never would have been able to.
Well, it's fascinating because now I'm curious at like where that comes from, or because it seems like there's references in almost every episode. Because if it was something that was just jumping out at you, it was a conscious effort by the writers of the show, and that's probably like showing like their age and what, they grew up on all these TV shows, right? So they're fans of shows, so they wanted to like sprinkle them in. And it's interesting that they actually made it a point to continuously do it throughout the whole series, so much so that you were curious about what they kept talking. What are they talking about? And you're like, so now I got to dig deeper. So, but it's been a great way for you to get educated and now speak intelligently about all these topics. But you got to do research. I mean, like you got to watch the movies and is it like books you got to read or like other stuff you got to do?
We don't do books.
Okay.
But I mean, even before this podcast, I was watching not old movies. Taylor is more into the Turner Classic Movies. She gets into that a little more, that era. But I was already watching obscure random movies that I was just curious about. And it's like, I need to go back and watch my 80s movies and things like that. So I wanted a podcast that would fit into my life as it is already in some ways, because I'm already watching random TV shows and movies. So as far as the research, that part of it, it's like I was already doing that. So that made that easy. But then we also, of course, dig in deeper and find out too what these different TV shows and movies meant at that time, because we weren't living in it. And so we have to look back, we don't just know because we lived it. So that's been fun too. And I also call my mom sometimes. I'm like, hey, tell me, Mary Tyler Moore is what did that mean to your generation?
Yeah.
And so that's been really fun too.
I'm curious if that's like just an aspect of your personality, like when you were watching Gilmore Girls, like do you just like have a natural curiosity? Because when some people watch it and they don't get the reference and they don't think much of it, but you were watching it, you saw the reference, and that's sort of like it's sort of like stuck with you. Like I need to know what that means. So is that just in your nature?
Yeah. So I always say this, like I have never been a hardcore fan of like a band or a person or a movie. I've never had like a bunch of posters on my wall. I just always wanted to learn about anything. And I would, have a night where I would just deep dive into, one night it was Michael Jackson and his relationship with Maria Presley. I remember that. And I was just watching Oprah interviews and like I was just curious. And so I've figured it out. So that is definitely a part of who I am. And that's why I love podcasting. That's why I love interviewing people, because I get to learn something and hear about what they have knowledge in and I don't. But then I get a little bit of that knowledge sprinkled in. But one thing I was thinking of as we're talking that I didn't want to forget to mention was with, you talked about the creators of the show and always sprinkling that in. And we talk about all the time, Amy Sherman Palladino. How did she do it? She's the creator of Gilmore Girls and Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. That's been out recently. Oh, yeah. And she, in an interview recently, made a reference to, was it Leopold and Loeb? I forget what it was exactly, but it was something that we had actually covered in So It's a Show, and she was using it in real life. And that was like total proof to us that this is all on purpose, because the references do fit really well.
So when are you going to have her on the show?
Well, as soon as we make her acquaintance. Yeah, we haven't reached out to any Gilmore Girls actors or creators, but we've had a few people on the show based on the pop culture that we're covering. So we had someone on who created a documentary about fans of the movie Ishtar, which is notoriously a terrible movie.
Yeah.
And it was. But he loves it, and he made a documentary with the man who played Gilbert Blythe on Anne of Green Gables.
Okay.
Who recently passed. And so we had him on to talk about, why do you love Ishtar? Because we need to understand
That's funny.
where this love comes from. So that was really fascinating. And we had on a couple authors who we didn't, read all their books, but we did some, research about them, read some of their articles.
Yeah.
And yeah, so we love having on like experts in the pop culture because then we get to find out more.
Yeah, it seems like that would be a good get. Should do it maybe for like episode 100, because the nature of your podcast is based on how they decided to write the show. So like it's you should start putting it out into the universe. So some interesting stuff has happened when people have actually publicly made that intention on Podcast Junkies, just so you know. So
okay. All right, I'm gonna declare it then. I'm gonna interview some Gilmore Girls writers.
Yes, it's gonna happen, and just let us know when it does.
Okay.
So in 2018 at Podcast Movement, you were actually on the Podcast Movement stage. You were in the Podcast Makeover Broadcasting Pros Critique Upcoming Podcasts panel. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was so awesome. I don't mind being up on stage. But I didn't realize when I applied for that, I thought it was more of like there would be a podcast or radio professional at a table and then a couple podcasters who haven't been doing it as long with them, and then you can kind of talk about it. That's what I pictured it as. And then I got an email and call from a representative from Jacobs Media, and they're like, "Hey, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about this." And I said, "Okay." And he asked me a couple questions and said, "So, would you like to participate?" And I paused for a second because I thought, well, yeah, that's why I applied, can I be in on the discussion? and so then as we talked more and I said yes, he explained it to me and I was like, oh, there's only two of us. So I thought it was like anyone can come and be critiqued. So I was a little confused on that, but I was happy with the format as it was. That was, so I sent in an episode, gave him a link to one of my more recent episodes that I liked. And not that I don't like some of them, but one that I thought where I did a good job. And they listened to it and then brought their feedback. And so he would play little clips. The host would play little clips from it. And then we'd talk about it. And radio and podcast professionals would tell me. And there are someone from PRX.
Wow.
Radiotopia. And so I was just like, oh, hello, tell me. Be my friend. Hire me something.
Was that weird here? Because they would play it over the sound system, right? So the whole audience heard it, right?
Yeah.
What was that? What was that feeling like?
I was just really honored. I thought it was really special and it was exciting to me. I wasn't nervous. I didn't feel insecure because I was proud of the episode. So I loved that more people got to hear it, honestly. So they gave me some great feedback. I sat back down and took a ton of notes, and then I watched it, when the recorded sessions came out on Podcast Movement and took in that feedback because some of the things they said, I knew I was having issues with, but I didn't know how to fix it. And they put it into words, and I was like, yes, that's what I need to be doing.
What's one of the tips they gave you?
One of them was about my narration wasn't consistent. So I would be narrating and then we'd have our discussion, narrating, discussion. And then suddenly there was no narration for a long time. And I was like, you're right. That is weird. It should be more consistent. So now I make sure, whether it's by certain minutes or page, that I don't have a big gap. And there were other things, but that's the one that I'm remembering now. So that was really, really beneficial. And even actually the insights they gave to the next person who went, his show was more like my Gilmore Girls show, more fan-based and discussion. And so I've used some of the tips they gave him in So It's a Show.
And what was the tip for that show format?
Let's see. They talked to him about, since his episode is so long, you need to tease what's coming up so that people know. And so I built that in a little bit, like, oh, we're going to talk about this later, but right now, get into this. So that was one that I remember.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think sometimes people take that for granted, especially, I think, as a podcast junkie, I look at the length of an episode now, and I'm like, I have to decide if it's worth my time. And I think that's something valuable that most podcasters forget. Probably if it is going to that 45-minute, an hour mark. And that's something I've started to do with this show, just lead in. So I have the show notes written a first pass, and then I know what the bullet points are. And then I use that to sort of introduce so people get an idea of what we're going to talk about. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So I really enjoyed that. I recommend that anyone to try that, because you're getting feedback from professionals beyond, where you're at directly. It's not just general advice. It is about your show.
Yeah. So what's got you excited with either of the shows as you move forward?
Well, I'm excited about this new episode for Yajmownen with storytelling and sound effects. I'm looking up a bunch. I've got barking dogs and scary monster sounds. So get ready for that. For So It's a Show, I'm excited to get some more guests on. Need to focus on that. But, that being on my off time, just on my own time, takes a lot of determination to okay, I need to set aside this time, figure out some guests, reach out. I mean, we don't even have any sponsors, mainly because we haven't tried, because we both are working full time, and it's an extra time that we haven't set aside. But I'm excited just to continue on, because I love learning.
And you've got the podcasting bug.
Yeah, I definitely do. But I'm excited for future too. I've been looking at other podcast specific opportunities. So just putting it out there. Anybody looking for a producer, associate producer, I'm right here.
A couple questions as we wrap up. What's something you've changed your mind about recently?
Oh, something I've changed my mind about recently. I was out of left field. I don't know. I've changed my mind about how good of a plant mom I am. Trying to be more optimistic, keeping all these plant babies alive.
How many do you have?
Oh my. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
Wow.
Yeah, that is a lot, isn't it? But my desert rose just started sprouting some new leaves, and I thought maybe I'd killed it. So that's been encouraging.
Well, they always say that if, that's the first sign that you can actually take care of something or that's living. You start with a plant, right? And then you move on to a pet. But if you can't take care of a plant, then that's probably a good place to start.
Yeah. They're tough, though.
Yeah. What's the most misunderstood thing about you?
Oh, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is about that if I'm having fun, I'm not able to switch to being serious too. So I tend to, and I've learned this lately from people at work and other more serious places that I've interacted with, that people think I'm really straight and I don't have a good time. But then but in personal life, always that, just the lively. And so I think people from work life think I'm just serious, and why don't you talk more? And then people in personal life are like, why aren't you more serious?
That's so funny.
So that's something I've been realizing.
Well, Kai, thanks so much for making the time to be on the show. I'm glad we got the chance to connect, and I learned a lot more about you too. And that's the beauty of these conversations and what you're doing with the show. And so, who would have thought us connecting all those years ago at Podcast Movement would have had us end up here. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Where's the best place for folks to track you down and to listen to both shows?
You can find me on Twitter at Kyla Carneiro, KylaCarneiro. Although I suppose you can probably read it in the show notes. And that's going to have all my links and everything.
Thanks again. Hope you have a fantastic week.
Thanks, you too.
Thanks again to Kyla for coming on the show. Always appreciative of folks taking the time out of their busy schedules to share their stories with you. It's not something I take lightly. Don't forget to tune in next week for my conversation with Gordon Firemark, host of the Entertainment Law Podcast, which he's been doing for over 10 years, which is crazy impressive. Don't forget to check out our sponsor, Focusrite, sponsors of the show, and their awesome line of fantastic sound gear, and specifically something I can't live without, the Scarlett 2i2 sound card. It was nice to run into Dan recently at the NAB conference. Intro and outro music composed by Cedar and Soil, cedarsoil.com for all of his fantastic music. And if you made it this far, the retention hashtag will be hashtag Kyla Stories, Kyla Stories, one word, and you can tag Kyla at Kyla Carneiro, that's KYLACARNEIRO, and tag podcast_junkies as well to let us know you made it that far. Thanks for all you do to support the show. Love you guys, and talk to you next week.